Hey everybody, welcome. I'm SARA WISEMAN. Today we're working on what does change teach us? What does change teach us? In any lifetime, you will have shocks to the system. Loss, illness, divorce, accident, trauma. These shocks disrupt the pattern, interrupt all the misbeliefs and distractions so that you are shocked into soul self. And of course, whenever we see from soul perspective, all becomes crystalline. We see our true essence as a result of this shock. From hardship comes understanding, from presence comes insight. In the mindfulness of any moment awaits a kind of rapture. As a person who's been through a lot of change, a lot of it pretty rough, and as you guys listening out there who I also know have been through massive loss and grief, trauma, I kind of find this a little difficult to take in, like, oh, everything happens for a reason. That is true, but it doesn't feel that great necessarily. Or, when one door opens, when one door closes, another opens, or whatever that is. Or, we're all here for lessons. And I do also believe those. I also have seen that pattern so many times, and yet the shocks to the system, when they're happening, it's very, very hard to keep soul perspective when we're in this place of like loss, illness, divorce, accident, trauma. When we're in that place of experiencing the emotional or the physical trauma, it's very, very hard to deal with. It's very hard to take a higher level perspective. So I would kind of suggest, if you're in that place, either if that's happening right now, or if you're still in shock or PTSD or grief or anger or whatever the feeling is that you're in because of that event, I would just be with that fully and allow yourself to feel everything. Just feel everything. And when time continues and there's a little more space between you and all the things that have happened, then that's time to go back and look at it, not from, this is hard because one part of me is like, I really understand how people are hurting. But to go into it and look at it not as a victim, and also not as spiritual bypassing, like, oh, that trauma was the best thing that ever happened to me. No, it wasn't. It wasn't the best thing, but it was something that happened in your lifetime. It was an event that happened from birth to whenever you're going to die. That happened, and that provided the opportunity for change, because it said these shocks disrupt the pattern. The pattern was things were going along. Maybe you were paying attention, maybe you weren't, maybe you were right on track, maybe you were fooling yourself, maybe you were with great people, maybe you were with horrible people. I don't know, but the shock disrupts the pattern. And you're shocked into having to look at things from a higher perspective. You could stay in the emotional state, rehashing over and over. You can do that. And also, all of this trauma takes so much time to work through. But when you get to a certain point, and again, this idea, when we see from soul perspective, all becomes crystalline. And sometimes a little thing I do is, well, a couple things. So if I'm dealing with some fairly recent trauma that I've been through, I'll of course take that up to the guides and continue that practice of connecting in and figuring out not necessarily why, but sort of like what was the reason. I guess that is kind of why, but sort of what was the reason that that soul lesson was provided. And then sometimes I'll pretend I'm a guide looking down at myself, sort of throwing the lessons down so that my soul in this human container with this personality is given all the pieces that will help that self grow to the greatest understanding. And I do think that for people who have experienced a lot of hardship or trauma, especially when they're young, but also later, that does it opens you in a way so that you see life differently. You don't just see this rosy picture, because you know it's not that. And when you know it's not that, when you sort of lose your innocence, that's where the compassionate heart can really start to open. When you're innocent and naive, you're sort of just prancing around unknowing. When you've had the terrible traumas or the terrible experiences and the hardships, and then you still can continue with a place of compassion, that's where the true growth begins to happen. Again, if you're too close to it, you may need more time. But if you've had some time, you might begin to look at it that way. The last piece of this is not all change is negative. Sometimes change is just like you move, you get a new job, you have a different relationship, something else happens. And so those are also shocks to the system and disruptors to the pattern. And they teach us, so the trauma level shock teaches us something. The positive shocks also bring us to places of growth. So anytime you're in a period of a lot of change, anytime things are no longer the way they were, just look at this idea of disrupting the pattern, interrupting all the misbeliefs and distractions so that you can hone in, so that you are shocked into soul self. You can look at everything from that perspective. Thanks for listening.